Yes. Hello, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alejandro Esteves. I am the director of the CDO. Our today webinar is about science and public policy. And let me introduce the speaker. Our guest today is Éric Montpetit. He's a PhD in comparative public policy for McMaster's University, Canada. He is also vice doyen in Faculty of Arts and Science and professor in the Political Science Department of the Université de Montréal, Canada. His current research is focalized on the behavior of policy actors like interest groups, civil servants, public opinion, and on the politics of scientific expertise in Europe and North America. His publications cover several subject areas, including contaminated soil, biotechnology, energy, climate change, and public health. Éric has currently received research funding from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. His 2006 book, Misplaced Distrust, won the American Political Science Association Linton Keith Caldwell Prize for the best book on environmental politics and policy. And his latest book, In Defense of Pluralism, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. And with the comments, we have Civil Rhodes. Civil is a PhD in political science and Master of Arts in political science in Stanford University. She is professor with tenure and director of the Department of Political and Juridical Science at UCEMA, Buenos Aires, Argentina. So let's start our webinar. Éric, please, you have 30 minutes to talk, and Civil will make after 10 minutes. It's okay, Civil? It's okay, Éric?
Fine.
Fine by me.
Yes, let's go.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you for the invitation. Really glad to be here. I wish I was in Argentina, but unfortunately traveling is still a bit difficult, but this is very convenient, I should say. My talk, let me share my screen with you. I have a short PowerPoint. So in my talk today, I will try to address four main questions. Like the first question is, should policies be aligned? Actually, before I move on to the four specific questions, this is the general question of the talk. Should policies be aligned on science, basically? And I suppose that most people think so. We have someone who's actually very famous who does think so. This is a quote from Greta Thunberg, who addressed the American Congress in September 2019. And obviously, she is of the opinion that that scientists should be listened to by policymakers. She said, "I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists. I want you to unite behind the science, and I want you to take real action." Of course, she was talking about climate change. She has this view of policymaking as or this desire that policymaking is quite strictly aligned on science. In my own work, what I do is, well, let's say, take on this statement and try to see or try to let's say, see the complications with this. Of course, I mean, it's an ideal that many people will share, but in reality, it might be a little more complicated. And I'm trying in my own research to show where those complications are. One of the things that I do in research, I was trained in public policy. And I guess the main literature on which I rely in my own work is the public policy literature. But in recent years, I have become more and more familiar with the science and technology studies. And I kind of like to mix those two literature. And this is what I'll be doing here to try again to show you the complexities of this ideal that many of us actually share. Now, let me move on to those 4 questions that I was announcing a bit earlier. First questions that I'll address is which science should be listened to? The word science is intuitive. In reality, there might be a bit more than just one or single science, a united science. It's a bit more complicated than that again. Second question, who should listen to what? When we say that science should be listened to, are we talking about elected officials? Obviously, this is what Greta Thunberg had in mind when she addressed Congress. She was addressing politicians, elected officials, but elected officials are not the only actors taking part in policy making. What about the others? Should they be as attentive to science as elected officials? The third questions. Do those who should listen actually listen? This is a very empirical question. Let's say that Greta Thunberg, as well as many others, assume that scientists are not listened to. Is it true? That's the third question that I'll be addressing. And the fourth question, should scientists get involved with politics? Is it their role to do so? What does it involve, and what might be the consequences if they do so? So those are, again, the 4 questions on which I have organized my presentation today. First question, which science should be listened to? For this, I was saying earlier that I rely more and more on science and technology studies. Actually, this entire slide comes from one of the famous author in science and technology studies, that's Harry Collins, who has written this terrific book, Are We All Scientific Experts Now? I do advise it to everyone. I mean, it's accessible, it's great, and he does succeed in this to present us a complex view of what science is. Very often when we assume that policy should be aligned on science, we have a very simplistic view of science. In fact, it's a bit more complicated than that. And one of the things that he does is kind of instead of viewing science as something very unified, something very specific that can be pointed at, he does see it as made of, let's say, various circles, and at the very center are those whom we often think of scientists. It's those who produce knowledge, those who work in the lab, if you want, and those are the scientists whom we assume should be involved in policy making. I'm quite sure that when Greta Thunberg said, well, you should listen to the scientists, what she had in mind is those scientists who do produce knowledge. And then you have, again, various circles that are, gradually removed from this center or from those who produce knowledge. The second one is quite important when it comes to policy making. It's the experts who communicate knowledge. Very often they do have a training in science. Most of them do, actually. They are in touch, they are in communication with scientists who produce knowledge, but they themselves don't have a lab, if you want. But they are in contact, in communication with people who produce knowledge. And their main function here is to communicate, not to produce knowledge, it's to communicate knowledge. And then the third one, knowledge users, again, one step further removed, and as you move away from the producers of knowledge, the likelihood is that you're going to come across people who don't necessarily have a training in science, but they might, but not always. And then the fourth circle that I have identified here is journalists, teachers, the general public. And you could add various circles of people. And again, as you move away from the center, the people there are probably less likely to be in contact or in communication with knowledge producers. Whereas again, those in the first circle, in the first circle removed from the center, the experts who communicate knowledge, they frequently are in contact with scientists. Now, again, the expectation is that those who should be involved are those who have the best knowledge, and it's easy to assume that those who have the best knowledge are those located in the center, the knowledge producers. But then again, Harry Collins explains very clearly that what happens inside the core set is hugely complicated. Producing knowledge is a complicated process. It's very often messy. There are conflicts. Researchers are humans, so therefore you can expect some level of conflicts. But not only that, the process by which knowledge production occurs is not like this linear process that we sometimes have in mind. There are some setbacks, there are some questions, very serious questions. There are, again, like those setbacks that, some questions are clearly given up. New tracks are taken. There's a lot of error and learning from error that occurs in the center, and because of that, scientists who produce knowledge very often will have a lot of uncertainties. They'll be uncertain about the knowledge that they produce. They very, very often do not have the kind of certainty that we often see among experts that we see on TV, for instance, that make the news. Very often, those who make the news are not those who are located in the center. They're in peripheral circles from the center. Again, they may be in touch with people in the center, but they're different. Their main function is to communicate knowledge. And therefore, in doing so, they have to display a level of confidence that you might not see in the center. In fact, the discourse that you would find in the center, in the labs, might be totally unfit for policymakers, or certainly not what a policymaker would expect. Again, a policymaker, when he or she has to make a decision, wants some level of certainty. Nuance, uncertainties, expression of uncertainties is not what policymakers expect. It's very difficult to act on, again, nuance and uncertainty. What they want is some level of certainty that experts in the center very often will refuse to provide. So those experts that we see, those who very often are at the forefront of policymaking, are the experts whose role is mostly to communicate knowledge. And in communicating knowledge, they tend to play down the level of uncertainty simply because otherwise their message won't be received quite as well, especially if the receiver of the message is policymakers. Again, they need some level of certainty to make decisions. And therefore, they tend to some of the nuance of the scientific discourse get lost when you move away from the center. What Éric Collins was saying is distance lends enchantment. Basically, what you hear from people who are not at the center is some kind of a fairy tale about what's happening at the center. Again, the center sometimes can be ugly. Producing knowledge can be an ugly thing. And those are the things that we never see, that policymakers don't even want to know. What they want to know is that producing knowledge is great. We have rigorous, serious scientists who know what they're doing and that they produce certain knowledge. And that's exactly the type of message that experts who communicate knowledge are willing to transmit. So when we say that the ideal is that when we expect policymakers to listen to science, very often we have in mind the experts who produce knowledge, but in reality, it's the experts who communicate knowledge who are in fact the interlocutors for policymakers. And because of that, there is some distortion between what actually happens in the center and what is actually communicated to policymakers. So that is an important thing. We policymakers might or might not listen to experts, but when they do, very often they'll speak to experts whose job is to communicate knowledge and not to produce knowledge. And in listening to these people, they are exposed to some distortion from what is happening at the center. And then again, in this ideal of policymakers listening to science, we expect that the science is the science as it is produced at the center, and not a science that lends enchantment, to paraphrase Harry Collins. So that's the first thing. So which science should be listened to? Well, again, it might not be the type of science that we expect that is actually listened to, or that can even be listened to, because again, it would be very difficult for policymakers to communicate directly with the scientists at the center. There would be some disappointment in the sense that, again, policymakers, what they need is some level of certainty, and it's something that knowledge producers sometimes cannot provide. So that's the first question. Second question now. Who and I'm sorry about this this slide. It's in French. I have recycled this from a previous presentation, and it's images, and I just could not translate it. So the second question is, who should listen to what? And what you see here is a very simplistic description of the policy process. Now I'm moving to the public policy literature. And again, like the first step, the one that is darkest on the slide, is prioritizing, agenda setting, if you like. The second one is the search for solution to the problems that have been prioritized. The third one is policy implementation. And the last one is policy evaluation. So those are the basic steps, again, of policy makings, and it doesn't, we all know that, happen in that order. It's not even clear that we can distinguish these four steps, but for the sake of the presentation, I'm presenting this way. The tone of the blue on the side indicates the level of involvement of elected officials. Very often when we blame policymakers for not listening to science, in fact, we blame elected officials. Again, Greta Thunberg went to address Congress, so elected officials. She was asking elected officials to listen to the science. So in the policy cycle, elected officials have a very important role when it comes to prioritizing problems, agenda setting. They have a role as well when it comes to the search of solution, but at that step, the variety of actors, the diversity of actors tend to increase. They have a smaller role when it comes to policy implementation, and probably an even smaller role when it comes to policy evaluation. So the role of policymakers is prioritizing problems, agenda setting. I mean, that's where they are most involved, to put it that way. Now, scientists are also involved at that level. Very often, it's scientists who basically set the agenda, who provide the information on the severity of problems. And every day we hear scientists pointing at new problems. And we very often hear them through the media, but policymakers themselves are, and elected officials especially, are themselves exposed to a very long list of new problems pointed out by experts, by scientists, very often, and it's true every day. They have access to experts who work in the public service, for instance. They participate in various events, and in all of those events, there are some scientists, some experts to basically remind them that something is very problematic. So again, elected officials are exposed to scientists, and scientists, one of the main things that they do when they address policymakers is to tell them that they should pay attention to some problems. The list here is in French. I guess you can make sense of it. Let me mention a few of them. Of course, climate change. And those are perhaps problems that are mostly important in Canada. At least it's something that I've come up with just from reading the newspapers in recent weeks. But I'm sure that those problems also are, to an extent, on the agenda in Argentina or and elsewhere in the world. Pesticides is a huge thing. We hear about plastics all the time, and again, it's scientists who tells us that plastics in the environment is a big problem. We have huge problem with healthcare, like COVID is. I don't know if it's as big in Argentina as it is here, but for the past 2 years, we've been hearing people talking about infectious disease, about COVID in particular, but also about the healthcare system that needs to be reformed, that the treatment of patients is not adequate given these new infections that are going to become more and more common, and they beg policymakers to pay attention to these problems. Forestry is a big thing here. The sustainability of our forest, it's a huge thing in Canada. Security in transports, the maintenance of public infrastructures, toxic products in water, agriculture, feeding the world, feeding the population, supply, and now one of the big thing that one of the big problem that economists tell us that, or tell politicians that they should pay attention to right now is inflation. So I mean, every single day, politicians, elected officials are exposed to scientific discourse or to several scientific discourses telling them that they should pay attention to this problem and that problem and that problem. And it is very clear that it matters, that scientific discourse has an impact on priorities. But one thing also that is clear is that politicians cannot pay attention to all of these problems at the same time. They're humans, human attention is limited. They can probably at most pay attention to 3 or 4 problems at the time. Baumgartner and Jones have done some studies of this, and I think that they come up with 3 or 4 as the figure that given, the cognitive limitation of humans, 3 or 4 problems at the time is probably the most that we can take on. So they select, policymakers, elected officials, they select a number of problems. And what will happen to, say if politicians decide tomorrow that pesticide is the big thing and that they begin to pay attention to pesticides, what will scientists who worry about plastics in the environment will say? Well, they will say that politicians don't listen to scientists. Is it true? Of course not. They just don't listen to them, but they listen to other scientists who are worried about pesticides, but their worries is somewhere else. So again, we have to be a bit, we have to be prudent about this discourse, basically claiming that scientists are not listened to. Very often, it's not that scientists are not listened to, it's that some scientists are not listened to because politicians have to make a choice. and our elected officials, parliament and all that, they cannot, take on a long list of problems at the same time. They have to choose. I mean, it's in the nature of things, and therefore choosing also creates some disappointment, and it's likely that those who are disappointed will argue that politicians don't listen to science. We have to be prudent about such discourse. Now, if you move on to the search for solution, let's say again that politicians decide to prioritize pesticides in one country. They move on to some search for solution, and then they will probably quite quickly realize that it's more complicated than what the scientist was saying at the outset. At the outset, those scientists at the outset who told politicians that they should pay attention to pesticides were worried about pesticides in the environment and the impact on health. And then politicians say, okay, well, it might be a serious problem. We should look at this. Very, very quickly, there will be some people who say, well, we also have to be careful with this. If we cut pesticides right away, there might be an impact on agricultural production and therefore our capacity to feed everyone. So basically what the politician will say is, okay, now maybe that just having people who are experts in toxicology is not sufficient to look at this issue. Maybe that there are other dimensions that should be taken into account. And then they'll invite agricultural economists and perhaps some people in agronomy who are able to assess the importance of a reduction in pesticides on agricultural productions and who know things about alternatives to pesticides to combat pests and so on and so forth. And as the discussion will go on, a new dimension will appear, and probably that more scientists will need to be involved. And at some point, a decision will have to be made, and the problem will have to be defined with some limits. And that will also limit the number of experts taking part of it. But I mean, there is almost no limit to the extent to which experts could, in theory, be involved. And then again, there is a decision point. And therefore, there will be, again, here, some exclusions of scientists. One of the things that is one of the interesting citation that I got from oops, sorry about that. How do I get that? Okay, one of the interesting quote that I got from Baumgartner is that diversity is inversely related to ease of decision making. In other words, the more scientists you involve in the search of solution, the longer it will take to come up with a solution. And that is also a very common complaint, that politicians just take too long. They don't act. Scientists say that it's urgent to take action on pesticides. Greta Thunberg was saying that she was expecting some actions very quickly on climate change. But then again, if you involve scientists more in the process, or if you involve more scientists in the process, it's just going to make the process longer. And it's going to take more time. So involving more scientists, or in other words, involving science more in policy process, might not make for quicker solution. It might actually require more time to come up with a decision, some kind of a compromise that will also unsatisfy some scientists, because then again, each scientist tends to be preoccupied with one or two dimensions of a problem. And if you have like, I don't know, 3 or 4, 5 scientists around the table, each having their own dimension, what you'll come up with is some kind of a compromise between all of these preoccupations, and then you're likely to make some people around the table unsatisfied. And what will these people say? They'll simply say again that politicians don't listen to science. So again, not quite as simple as some people or as the ideal of listening to science suggests. Now, do those who should listen actually listen? And here I will have a very, very simple slide. Yes, I think that's quite clearly what the research in public policy suggests, that elected officials, that civil servants, those actors who are not themselves scientists in the policy process tend to listen to scientists. They don't listen to all the scientists at the same time. Again, it's impossible, either for reasons of prioritization or for reasons of the search for solution to a given problem. It's impossible to listen to everyone. And then again, science is not a unified world. You're going to have scientists who are going to say one thing and other scientists who's going to say a different thing, even within the same field. And again, if once a problem reach the agenda of policymakers, it tends to complexify. Some dimensions are added, justifying the inclusion of experts coming from different fields. And the more field of science that you include in policymaking, the more disagreement that you're going to come across among scientists. And therefore, a choice will have to be made between these various views, scientific views. And therefore, in this process, you're going to have create some disappointment, and those who are disappointed will complain that science has not been listened to. Not true. Some science might have been ignored or have been less taken into account, but it has been done at the benefit of other scientific knowledge. So again, policymakers, elected officials, they do listen to the science as much when it comes to prioritizing problems as well as when it comes to a search for solution. Now, my last question. Should scientists get involved with politics? I mean, again, a very simple slide, and it's just to remind that science and politics are two different universes. They don't have the same function. Science, the goal here is to produce knowledge, search for the truth. And searching for the truth is not, it's a long process. It's not an easy one. And it involves some level of disagreement among scientists. And very often when we know the truth, the issue is no longer, and again, it's not for everything, but when we know the truth, the scientific issue is no longer a matter that is relevant to politics. When we launch a satellite, we don't need to ask scientists first whether the Earth is round, a sphere, whether it is possible to have a satellite in orbit around the Earth. We know those things. Again, like very often when politicians have to rely on some scientific knowledge to make policies, it is because there is some uncertainty about the knowledge. If there was certainty, they wouldn't have to ask. We just would know. And when there's uncertainty, it's quite clear that there will be some disagreement among scientists. So there's again very different function. Science is producing knowledge, looking for the truth. In the process, it's a long process. And it involves some disagreement and some uncertainty. Politics, they have to make decisions, and they have to make decisions within a time frame. Politicians, cannot take 10 years to make some decisions. Very often, they have a limited mandate, 4 or 5 years. In most countries, they want to have some accomplishments, some achievements within those years, and therefore they have to make decisions in context of uncertainty. And it is in those circumstances quite obvious that they will have to choose between some scientists and perhaps ignore others, again, who disagree among themselves. So should scientists get involved with politics? Well, if their goal is to produce knowledge, maybe that they don't have to. They probably keep being involved with producing knowledge. There are some experts who communicate knowledge, and they are quite essential to policymakers. Again, what is happening at the center of knowledge production is very complex, and you need people who can simplify what's going on there so that it makes sense for politicians. But then again, it's a bit different than just, letting politicians be guided by science. It's more complex than that. It's very much two universe, and it's just okay if scientists choose to remain with science and not get involved too much with politics, leaving that to experts who define their role mostly as communicating scientific knowledge. So I'll stop here. I think that I've been probably a bit longer than I should have been. So, questions?
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Eric. It was a pleasure to listen to this presentation. I want to thank Alejandro Esteves and CDOP also. I think it's really wonderful to hear an optimistic voice in these polarized times. For my first comment, I wanted to comment about what you said about when you showed the diagram from the Collins book about science, and you pointed out that at the center of the scientific enterprise, creating knowledge, things can be quite messy and not always a joy to look upon. And I was reminded of that old adage that we don't want to know very much about the process of sausage making or about lawmaking. And perhaps here we can add the scientific process. So that was interesting. At the same time, I think what you said towards the end of your remarks, comparing how the roles of politicians and of scientists are different because they have different objectives and different time frames. I think those things are crucial. We need to, politicians do need to listen to science, but I think politicians also have to adjudicate upon among many conflicting interests, many voices. So their job is more than listening to scientists, I suppose. I think they have to listen to many more voices. So I think that's an interesting element of what you were saying. I really do think that this is a great project. There's so many wonderful things that you said. I'm really full of questions, but I think also I had wanted to say in the beginning that this is truly an international meeting. So that's wonderful. Lots of languages, countries. So really a great fun to participate. I think that the topics you raise are relevant everywhere, certainly here in Argentina, where I think everything you said is relevant. We are concerned about climate change. We're concerned about the environment. We're concerned about COVID. Many of the issue arenas you mentioned, some of the ones that you have worked on quite specifically, I know in some of your previous projects like agricultural biotechnology, those are very important to us here in Argentina. So I think we really have a lot to learn from your work. And particularly, I think it's at least as useful for us here in Argentina as it is there in Canada, the message that perhaps we can be a little bit optimistic about whether politicians can listen to scientific voices and make decisions that incorporate them. But also in general, whether we can be optimistic about the outcomes of both political and scientific processes that are, in the end, they're messy, just like sausage making. There's something that humans are doing, correct? So in a sense, I think especially with the changes in recent years, perhaps, and this was one of the questions I wanted to make of you, and then there are, I think, just a couple more in the comments that I'll also present to you, and perhaps I'll just present all of the questions together. But I'm wondering if what you think about social media and the way things have been changing in politics in general, how those affect the way you're looking at these questions. It seems to me, in a way, a solution is that we all really need to be educated to the fact that we've all learned more about politics and science, and about how, in the end, they're messy, and we just need to know that. So that is one of the questions that I had. And now there are several interesting questions in the chat. Sorry, I'm working with two devices here, so I know my video at times looks a bit odd. But there is an interesting question from Federico Giordano, who's asking, well, what has been the contribution of specific offices created in the U.S. Congress? He gives an example as the Office of Science and Technology, and that he says this one has been replicated in other places. Those would be some of the questions, and then there are a couple of others, but I think perhaps I'll present you with those two, and if we have time, perhaps we could do the others.
Well, let me begin by what you were saying about the fact that politicians have to listen not just to science. There are other actors in the process, non-scientists, and you know, they should be viewed just as important as scientists, and it's not always the case. And I have one example here in Canada right now. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, the federal government approved an oil drilling project in Newfoundland, and of course it was decried by many scientists who worry about climate change, and rightly so. Interestingly, the people who were interviewed in the media to speak about this and who were presented as possessing some scientific knowledge, they were very often affiliated with interest groups like Greenpeace or other environmental groups, I should say, groups like that. And I have no doubt that these people have a scientific background. But again, they're not those who are producing the knowledge, right? They are first and foremost militants, political militants. And so anyway, there was this discourse, scientific concern about this decision made by the federal government. And then the minister came on TV and said, well, it's interesting. I mean, and again, I am concerned with climate change. But then we had also an environmental assessment that was done before this. It was mandatory, and taking part in this assessment was like many high-level scientists. So again, it was scientists against scientists, Greenpeace scientists and other environmental scientists against those who did this environmental assessment. So the minister had to choose between scientists. But not only that, he said, Newfoundland, and for those of you who don't know Canada that well, Newfoundland is a province that has historically suffered quite a bit from difficult economic conditions. And they found some petroleum, some oil off the coast of Newfoundland just a few years ago. Like it was like, I think the first discovery was made like 20 years ago, and it was quite a relief for the economy of Newfoundland. And not approving those projects would basically bring Newfoundland back to what it was before oil was discovered there 20 years ago. And so the minister said, well, you know, I agree like that climate change is like a huge thing and that we should address it and we should be very careful. And again, this project will try to be as environmentally friendly as possible. But then we're going to keep consuming oil. If it's not, this oil that we're going to use, we're going to import it, or if we export it, because I think that the plan is to export this oil to other countries. If it's not us who import it, it's going to be other countries, and perhaps countries who don't have the same type or the same level of environmental concerns as we do. But then again, the main question was, should climate change be prioritized over employment in Newfoundland? And I mean, there's no easy answer to this, but I would tend to think that that employment is also a legitimate issue. Climate change, of course, it is, but the economy as well. There's some echo. I don't know if the sound is good on your side. It's working now, I think. Okay, the social media. I'm very concerned by that. And I'm concerned on that because sometimes we are discovering through the social media all the messiness of the center, as you suggested, because scientists sometimes are extremely active on social media, and some of them are not shy, do not shy away from expressing their disagreement with colleagues, and not always in elegant terms, to say the least. And I'm vice dean here at the University of Montreal. It's a faculty of arts and science, and we have some natural scientists. And sometimes when I look at what they do on social media, this is like the messiness of the center that is expressing itself there. So things have become a bit more transparent. We have more access to this messiness through the social media. But then again, I am not sure that the interpretation of the general public of this messiness is what it should be. To me, it's normal. I mean, it's life. Those people are humans. It's normal that they have disagreement, and especially in scientific fields. So there's nothing wrong with that. But it's not the main interpretation of the public. The main interpretation of the public might be that science just doesn't work. And that's a problem, because I think that science actually does work. So that would be my take on the social media. The problem is not the social media itself, because it increases transparency. It's mostly the interpretation that people make of what they see. That might be the problem. Questions on the special office of the Congress. Interestingly, we do have something similar here. We call it like chief scientists. So federal government has one chief scientist, and basically, and the provincial governments as well. And their role basically is to have, it's a resource for elected officials. Basically, elected officials can call them anytime and have some advice on issues that require some scientific knowledge. And it's quite interesting because I am in touch with the chief scientist here in Quebec, and the way he sees his role is quite interesting. Like he doesn't see his role as providing answers. Very often, that's what policymakers want. They want to know, GMOs, are they dangerous? Should we ban them? I mean, it's not the type of questions to which he answers. He will, do more science education towards policymaker, way more than answering like very specific questions that have some policy relevance. And that is very interesting, I think. Again, like elected officials, most of them, like they're drawn from the general public. Most of them don't have a scientific education. And then again, they are exposed to, the social media, for instance, that we just discussed, and they might have, the wrong view of science. And what the chief scientist does is really kind of providing them an interpretation of what they see and what's going on, rather again than a very specific answer to a policy question. And that I think is interesting. I think that it does kind of provide some nuance among policymakers on the role of science in policymaking, and on what to expect basically of scientists. I mentioned several times in my presentation that policymakers, for instance, expect certainty. Well, the chief scientist will provide some education over this issue to elected officials, explaining them that science is more complicated than that, and that I think is extremely useful.
So, Eric, I think Civil is experimenting some technical problems, but if you want to choose another question, the last question, if you want to answer, I think you have to quit us in several minutes because you have a meeting.
Yeah.
Can you choose the last question, please?
Okay, let me see.
I'm going to read it if you want, Eric.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a question from Andrea Bobris.
Yeah.
She said that, which would you say are good institutional arrangements in terms of coherence and integration when it comes to policies demanding a transversal approach, such a climate policy, especially taking into account what you have mentioned as regards the timing of decision making when science is part?
Yeah. Very good question. We have this expression here, and it's not used as much in policymaking, but to some extent, it's clearly used in the public service, and even here in the university. We say like that we approach problem in silos. I don't know if you have this expression in Latin America, but and it could be applied to policymaking. And my sense is that, well, first of all, I should say that I dislike the expression because I don't think that it does correspond to reality most of the time. And when it does, sometimes there are good reasons for it. And I'll get back to this example of pesticides. Again, most people that we hear who are, telling policymakers that they should pay attention to this problem are people concerned about the toxicity of these products for the health of farmers, health of those who use them, and the health of consumers as well. And that's a very, very legitimate concern. But then again, when you move on to prioritizing this problem, to searching for solution, you quickly realize that it's more complicated than that. And like I haven't seen anywhere in the world where pesticides have been treated solely as a problem of toxicity. Very often what happens when you begin to search for solution, you discover those other dimensions, and then you invite actors who can inform those new dimensions. And in terms on pesticides, it's exactly what's happening. It's true in Europe, it's true in Canada, it's probably true in Argentina as well. You have also agriculturalists who take part of the debate, who are involved in the debate by policymakers, because they can address, this issue of the impact of reducing pesticide on the supply of food. You have you have people even who are specialists of agricultural organization who basically have some ideas on how to reorganize agriculture just to make it less impactful on the environment, and so on and so forth. So you have always several dimensions that are involved, but at some point you have to stop. At some point you have to decide. Again, if you keep inviting people as you discover new dimension, the process will be endless. So politicians, at some point, elected officials, especially at some point, policymakers, those in position of authority, they have to decide that it's no longer, a good idea to integrate new dimensions into, this search for solution. And of course, that leads to people saying, okay, now they work in silo. See what they want is look at just one dimension. While in fact, it's not true. It's just that sometimes, we have to stop the process. And And again, I'm I guess optimistic about policymaking. I think that things are going much better than we tend to think so. Again, it's not true, in my opinion, that scientists are not listened to, and it's certainly not true that problems are examined in silos. They are not. I mean, there's always several dimensions that are taken into account, but perhaps not to the extent that some people would like. Some people would, and legitimately so, if they were to draw the line around the dimensions that should be taken into account, maybe that they would draw it in a different place than those in elected position or in position of authority. But again, it's not the same as saying that these people in position of authority, they act in silos. It's not true.
Especially thank your presentation and your webinar, Eric, from Buenos Aires, Argentina, from the University of Buenos Aires. I don't know, Alejandro, if you want to say some final words.
No, it's only thanks a lot, Eric. It's a pleasure to see you again. It's a pleasure to hear you again. And we keep in contact. Thanks a lot for your time. You know that you have to quit us at you have to quit in 2 minutes. So thanks a lot, Eric, for your time.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, Eric.
Thanks.